What's up, guys? Welcome back to RC Tactical. Today I have my Mini Z MR-03. Now this is going to be a kind of a light version of checking and lubricating the steering. I'm working on taking the top cover off and checking the gears in the steering, making sure that there is nothing obstructing anything from traveling freely. This is something I've seen posted many times in groups asking. I've recentered my servo, checked my trim, double checked the tightness of the front wheel nuts, and my car is still not steering and driving like it should. If you've already done all the above, checking the actual steering mechanism may be required. This is my first go at working on a model on camera, so tell me what you think about it, and if there is something you'd like to see changed, down below in the comments. If you find this helpful, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. I'm starting with the 4 screws on the top cover on this model. I have the titanium screw kit available through KYOSHO, and they seem to hold up better than the hardware provided stock on these chassis. Now, I could be using a better driver as well, but the stock hardware does seem pretty soft in my opinion. The upper control arms are also a part available through KYOSHO. I'll throw some links down below, some of the stuff you will see in the video so you can have a look for yourself and pull the part numbers you need to find it wherever you're going. The titanium hardware kit unfortunately does not include the control arm pivot screws, but I haven't found any issues with these ones, and they seem to thread just fine into the control arms. I have used Loctite and thread glue on a lot of other models and brands, but I haven't had any issues with these becoming loose on the control arm, so I haven't felt the need to use it here. There are usually C-clips here at the top of the kingpins, but I didn't put them back on after the last build. It hasn't seemed to affect any performance, however. And if you've ever dealt with these before, you know how frustrating they can sometimes be. When you're ready to take the top plate off, make sure that you get these clips undone from the rest of the upper portion of the chassis. And as you can see here, I chose the worst tool under the pressure of recording. It did get the job done eventually though. It would have been way easier if I had used a longer screwdriver or, as long as it has a flat tip on the end to pry those clips away, you'll do just fine. Now we can finally get a good look to see if there is anything in here causing any binding. Sometimes it is something incredibly small in one of those gears, keeping your car from running a good straight line. I'm checking to see if there is any one spot that is really rough throughout the steering travel. I found that should you need to get an especially tough piece of grit out of the gear, a precision flathead for like glasses or something like that, if you have a kit that has an incredibly small flathead to get in between there, it really helps dislodge it. The brass colored gear you can see in there is the metal fourth gear available through KYOSHO. I could tell a slight improvement in the steering longevity from installing this. However, regular maintenance on the steering assembly will keep your ride running without buying any more upgrades. All I'm doing now is checking the steering to make sure everything is moving fine and not fighting me before I put the top end back together. When you're putting the top cover back into place, make sure it clips nicely and sits flush with the rest of the chassis there. All the screw holes will line up fine and there shouldn't be any gaps between the top plate and the chassis. Now there's an awkward wait while I grab hardware. And we're back in business, folks. Some things go without saying, but I still choose to say them anyways. Do not over tighten the screws into plastic. That's one of the big things that, we've all ran into is running a screw down into plastic and it just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. And then you run into a bunch of problems. What do you do? Put glue in it, try to figure out some way to fix it, avoid all that. Just bring the screw down and then snug them up. I mean, just barely hand tighten. If you have to use a screwdriver that's actually smaller than what's comfortable, just so you don't over tighten it, sometimes you got to do it. In fact, that's what you can actually see me doing right here is just going around and making sure they're brought down, but not overly tightened. Yeah, that's an easy way to ruin a chassis. Now that the top plate is back on, I'm going to shift the focus to the bottom plate. And I'm going to start by taking the steering knuckles off of the chassis. Now a couple pieces go along with that. Whenever you go to try to take those off, you're going to have that pivot ball come off right that sits right underneath the control arm. You could have taken it off earlier, but I just chose to do that now. These screws usually take the brunt of the force since they're on the bottom. They get pretty scratched up, and usually they're a pain, especially if you haven't removed them for a while. So be cautious whenever you're going to run those out. Oh, there's one of the plastic washers. Those sit on the kingpin right underneath the steering knuckle, and they act as a spacer. Um, you can set ride height and droop with those. I usually use two under each side, but sometimes if there's an inconsistency from one side to another, you can use it to space one side up a little higher or lower to kind of match the ride height on both sides. And I get a little fixated on this rust underneath the kingpin there. Um, if you ever run into this problem, you could use a little bit of lubricant, like a silicone oil, to kind of assist to move freely. Make sure you wipe away any extra that you may have on there because that's just going to attract more dust and dirt, and you really don't want that in there either. Making sure that these kingpins move freely is a really essential part of your suspension system. You definitely want to make sure that those are able to move without any resistance on it because it's basically what makes your suspension work on the front end. You may be wondering what that little blue box above the chassis is. That is a easy lap transponder, and we use it at our local racetracks for lap counting. We also have one at my grandfather's place at Mad Racing. We have a fairly large track there as well to practice and run on. You can see once the lower plate is removed, you can get access to the tie rod in the lower portion of the steering assembly. You can't access as many components of the steering from the bottom, but you're able to clean the tie rod and lubricate the steering while you're down there. I prefer to use a dry lubricant like graphite powder. This stuff is great for places you don't want dirt to collect, like this. I picked this up from the local hardware store and have used it for quite some time with no issues, especially counting that these are the original steering gears, with the exception of the fourth one in line. When it comes to this stuff, less is more, and it can make an absolute mess on whatever your workspace is, so be mindful of that. You can see, after aggressively wiping down my workspace, the graphite left a shadow on it. I believe this is a Hot Racing Plus One aluminum tie rod that I have on here. And I have this set up just because of how the car was acting. I wanted to put a plus one in there and see if it would help it at all. And I really enjoyed how the car performed. Well, now that may vary depending upon your setup, and if your car is stock, obviously it's going to be a plastic one in there, and that doesn't matter. You still want to take it out and double check to make sure that it is not too worn or has collected dust or dirt or grit on the top end of it, because that'll impede it from sliding back and forth between the plate and the chassis. I have found that the bottom plate is a pain to put back on the frame. You want to make sure that the tie rod is in proper position and that you gently spread the kingpins outwards to allow the plate to slide in place properly. Like before, remember not to over tighten the screws into the frame. The bottom ones I have found to be worse with this. They seem to strip easier, so definitely make sure you be careful. You can see everything is nice and flush and everything is back together as it should be as far as the plates go. And the tie rod moves back and forth nicely without any resistance. Keep doubling back around and making sure that those kingpins are nice and loose. After finding that rust in there, I kind of got fixated on that. You may say, RC Tactical, what are you doing? You only put one spacer underneath the steering knuckle on each side. And I will say, I accidentally blew two of those washers across the room to never be found again. And, that happens, and I have some extra in my kit, but just for the sake of this, I just put it back together without it, and it really didn't affect anything as far as performance-wise goes. I believe I actually had those underneath there to just change the stance of the car for some reason. Now, that was a couple months ago, so I'm having trouble remembering why I actually put two under each side. Maybe I didn't like the way it sit, or if I was hitting some seams somewhere on a track, but that's why I did it. I don't know why, but that one spring always fights me with going back in, and I should have did it earlier, and I knew this was going to happen, but if you put it over the tip of one of your screwdrivers, it really just makes it easier to drop it back into place there. I notice on the narrow setups of these, that is more of a pain because it's so close to the other side there. With the wider setups, you're using the other holes further out, and it just seems to set nicer out there. But that's the name of the game when it comes to these models that are so small. Once you get everything buttoned back up, you can actually feel if you've made a difference in the steering. Everything should be moving freely, and nothing should be binding anywhere throughout the movement of the steering or the suspension. Sometimes you may have to disassemble and repeat if you find something is not moving as it should, but you could always go back further in this video if you have to check it for reference. That's the main point of why I put this back together in here, guys, and I wanted you to have the information to be able to tear apart the steering and service it so you're not having a bad time, operating these cars. That's about all I have for you guys today, and I appreciate you for hanging in there through the video, and definitely let me know what you think about these types of videos. I would like to do more in the future and maybe even work at keeping the chassis in the view of the camera. I apologize about that. Until next time, guys, take care.